Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee McKenna. I'm a therapist and shamanic healer, and today I want to talk about non-duality. And non-duality refers to a mature state of consciousness where we are in communion with the oneness of all things. And descriptions of non-dual consciousness can be found in Hinduism, Buddhism, Sufism, mystical Christianity, and is even referred to by Plato. And the term non-duality comes from the Advaita Vedanta school of Hindu philosophy. And Advaita Vedanta literally means non-duality. And Vedanta is a classic Indian tradition of spiritual or self-realization. And it traces its roots back to the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, which are ancient Hindu texts. I actually have a little copy of the Bhagavad Gita that I've been super slowly making my way through. But like a lot of my self-help books, it sits on a shelf and I hope that I can just absorb it by osmosis by the book sitting there. I love books on spirituality and psychology, but they don't help you if you don't read them. So I was introduced to the Vedanta tradition through the Self-Realization Fellowship, which was brought to America by Paramahansa Yogananda. Say that 4 times fast. And the Self-Realization Fellowship still exists in many parts of the country. It was probably the first church kind of thing that I attended on Sunday mornings that I actually enjoyed at the Vedanta Center in Cohasset, Massachusetts. Paramahansa Yogananda was part of an Eastern influx in the early 1900s, and he's most famous for his book, Autobiography of a Yogi. And in my understanding, in the early 20th century, there was a bunch of high-level, highly evolved spiritual teachers and practitioners who kind of received this call or direction to bring their Eastern mystical practices into the West. And Paramahansa Yogananda was part of that Eastern wave. I did a modified version of Bikram yoga, which is hot yoga, for quite a few years, and that yoga was my spiritual practice. I found that when I was able to balance my body, it enabled me to be internally balanced as well. And in the studio where I practiced, there was a big picture of Paramahansa Yogananda. And he's looking right into the camera with these profoundly sublime and infinite eyes. And I would often stand gazing at that picture while I did my yoga practice, particularly if I was fucked up in any way. And that picture was like a transmission, was like a portal into that non-dual realm. There's a very powerful and ancient practice of praying to icons. And an icon is any form that represents the divine for you. And in many traditions, certainly Hinduism and Christianity, the imagery and iconography of statues and paintings and stained glass were ways not just to teach theology to the illiterate, but like all art forms, they speak to a deeper part of ourself. When we read or hear words, philosophy or theology, that speaks to our rational mind. And music, art, dance, yoga speak to the non-rational or intuitive parts of ourself. I'm a highly visual person, so I have lots of different representations of divinity in my house. I have different altars in different places. For me, God has infinite faces. In fact, from a non-dual perspective, all of creation, including ourself, is part of the one. So I still have a picture of Paramahansa Yogananda today next to Thich Nhat Hanh and Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and imagery of the divine feminine, Buddha, mixed in with a Celtic cross, a shamanic drum, and lots of little pieces of nature that I'm kind of constantly changing in and out depending on my different experiences. Rocks and tree bark, feathers. I'm a very relational person, and having these images of divinity really works to connect me directly with the higher power of my understanding. So contemplating an icon is not about believing that the icon itself is God. The image or the statue is a doorway or a portal that can connect us with ultimate reality. And for me, that connection with ultimate reality is imperative to make sense of ordinary reality. And the essence of most great religious, spiritual, or self-help personal growth traditions is about making that connection, however you understand it, with a deeper spiritual or non-physical truth, the ground of being of which we are all a part. So non-duality, in my limited understanding, is about our experience of the ever-present moment, of the infinite unfolding now. I love the Buddhist metaphor that we are like waves in the ocean that don't know that we're actually part of the water. And duality is our experience in our everyday, ordinary life of separation, of suffering, of fear, of losing what we already have or not getting what we really want, and the kind of baffling nature of the impermanence of all things. Buddha talks about the Four Noble Truths, that life is painful and that the origin of that pain is attachment or aversion, could be called desire, and that the path to freedom from suffering is to let go of attachment and desire, and that the eightfold path of right living, right thinking, and right action is a way to freedom from this suffering, to step out of duality into non-duality. There's a lot of really amazing spiritual teachers alive right now, bringing a variety of modern approaches to non-duality that are available for all of us, free on YouTube. Rupert Spira is an English potter I had the privilege of sitting with this year. Adyashanti is another. Muji is a gifted teacher from Jamaica with a voice I could just listen to him talk. I love Jamaican accent. It's like milk chocolate to your ears. And of course, Eckhart Tolle, the German-born little elf of a man who had his own spiritual awakening after suicidal depression and has spent his life now showing us how to be free as well. His seminal work is The Power of Now. And if you get a chance, I encourage you to download it on Audible or wherever you listen to audiobooks, because he reads The Power of Now and his voice is a transmission. I have received a few transmissions from powerful spiritual teachers, and a transmission, very similar to contemplating an icon, is like an energetic portal to the truth of what the teacher is teaching. That listening to their words, and Muji can have this same effect, the words themselves carry power. Not the intellectual meaning of the words, but again, perhaps like music or something even beyond that, they are able to open a door with their own energy, the door that they have passed through themselves. And a transmission is when a teacher holds that door open and lets the power that they are connected with come through directly to you. And I find that listening to Eckhart's voice very powerful. I was introduced to The Power of Now in 2002 when I was in graduate school, and revisited it during a recent time of big upheaval in my own life, when I was leaving the past but couldn't see the coming future and felt kind of like I was in the ocean without a life preserver, just barely keeping my head above the water. And Eckhart Tolle reminded me of the power of the present moment, that this is the only moment that is actually real. The time is an illusion and a construct, and that ultimate reality is available to all of us right now. No appointment needed. That in this world of duality, day and night, good and evil, selfishness and generosity, wealth and poverty, peace and inner turmoil, that our experience of the material world and the ever-changing, impermanent nature of all things is an illusion. In Hinduism, they call it Maya. In some traditions, they consider that our waking life is actually a dream, and that the ultimate truth, truth with a capital T, is when we wake from that dream and transcend the cycles of birth and death and realize that when the wave crashes on the beach, it's still part of the water. And I myself am more than a few clicks away from enlightenment, but my work in spiritual psychology is a really accessible doorway to start to pass through into that ultimate reality. And the non-rational, transpersonal aspects of ourself, like those icons in many religious and spiritual traditions, can be a really accessible vehicle for experiencing that connection and ultimate reality that most of us seek. I'm a little obsessed with the story of Adam and Eve and the expulsion from the garden. And I really see that creation myth or story as a wisdom teaching of our moving from non-duality into duality. That the experience of Eden and unification in our less developed, more natural state is this experience of oneness, just like I think wild animals and plants don't have an ego self and submit themselves more naturally to the continual cycle of birth and death, consumption and expulsion. And what gets Adam and Eve tossed out of the garden or separates them from that unified experience is eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I personally believe that's part of our evolutionary path. Of course, this story's laid over with guilt and they blamed it on Eve, right? Well, they actually blame it on the serpent. And the fascinating thing about the Adam and Eve story in Genesis is that the serpent actually tells the truth. And in that story, God lies. God tells them if they eat from that tree, they will die. And the snake says, you won't die. And it's true. They eat from the tree and they don't die. There's a great mystery there for me. Kind of like that yin-yang symbol where the light has some dark in it and the dark has some light in it. But to me, the story of Adam and Eve really speaks to our desire to understand why we feel so disconnected. And like a lot of us, we blame ourselves. There's this very interesting channeled material I've just gotten introduced to called The Law of One. And they talk about stages of conscious evolution or evolution of consciousness like notes on a scale. And that the human realm is actually, they call them densities. And the third density is where we are as humans. The first density is like unification of a more primal sort, like the elements, plants and animals that I was talking about, that are just a natural part of the creation without a development so much of their own consciousness. That's the unified state of the Garden of Eden. Second density is the beginning of the development of consciousness. The Law of One suggests that pets are second density beings, beginning to develop their own individuality. I have a client who names her plants, so it's a question if plants can be second density. Possible. So Adam and Eve were more in a second density state, just becoming aware of their individual self, and eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil pushed them into third density. Full awareness of their own unique individuality, but a separation or a forgetting of the unification from which they come. Densities 4 through 7 are a maturing development of our awareness of the unification or oneness of all things. But there's 7 levels of density altogether, and that each density has its own developmental skill set to learn that has some dynamic tension or friction in it. And the friction on the third density or human material plane is psychological suffering. I can attest to that. So I want to tell you a little story from a client this week. Very creative, intuitive woman feeling really disconnected from what she calls her core. And so we did an inner journey asking the question, how do I connect with my core? And she's been doing this work for quite some time and has a range of very powerful, what she experiences as guides and teachers that have gained her trust over time. And so this particular teacher, who looks like Totoro from the Hayao Miyazaki films, brings her through this portal into a place that looks similar to the town in the Miyazaki film Spirited Away, one of my favorite movies. And he brings her into this little shop, very dark, and there's a hooded figure sitting on a cushion with a bowl of water with 3 floating candles in front of him, and she's motioned to sit before him. And when he passes his hands over the bowl, the candles are able to reconfigure themselves. And we asked him how he would help her, and that the candles represented aspects of herself, and that he could help her in 3 ways: with reconfiguration, with connecting to herself, and to connect with something higher. And my client's experienced a lot of trauma, and trust definitely has to be earned for her. She was not trusting this dude with the hood that she couldn't see his face. And the thing I love about this work is that it's a teaching on so many levels. And for me, the distrust of this teacher mirrors the distrust she has in these aspects of herself. And when we asked who he was, he said he was the keeper of the core. We went in with the question, how do I connect with my core? And he didn't say that he was the keeper of her core. He said he was the keeper of the core, which to me points to a lesson in non-duality. And one of the central questions in non-duality is, who am I? Who am I really? Am I my name? Am I my profession? Am I my body, my feelings? Am I my experiences? What is this thing I call I? It's a very powerful practice of inquiry. The self-inquiry, who am I? And to me, that question leads back to that doorway I've referred to. That the I that I think I am, Renee LaValle McKenna, is an illusion. It's an impermanent state that's connected with the greater I am. But that when we can configure our candles optimally in the water, we can pass through that doorway. We can experience the peace which surpasses all circumstance and understanding. I've had glimpses of it. I peek through that doorway anytime I get a chance. And I hope this podcast today has helped you do the same. I'm offering a free workshop this week on karma and family of origin, just in time for the holidays. A deep and evocative look on what your family has to teach you on a soul level in this lifetime. Where does the configuration of our birth family call us to grow? That's going to be Wednesday, December 16th, noon Pacific, 3 Eastern. It's about 45 minutes. If you want to sign up, send an email to opendoorgrowth@gmail.com. If you're interested in exploring non-duality in your own life through spiritual psychology, you can send me an email, info@reneemckenna.com. Deep gratitude to my supporters on Patreon and blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee LaValle McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.